Hi, my name is Olga Leandris, and in this video, I will go over the part of the greenhouse gas impact assessment of agriculture policies that focuses on how to select and describe the policy. This video is part of a series of videos that give an overview of the ICAT agriculture methodology, and I encourage you to watch others that provide a general overview of the methodology, as well as those that cover other parts of the assessment process. The assessment process is set up in a modular way so that people can find easily the parts that are most pertinent and they're interested in. And it has three components. Part one is the planning for the assessment process, was covered in another video. Part two focuses on selecting and describing the policy. And that is what we will focus on in this video. And then part three is actually the methodology for estimating GHG impacts. Each assessment chapter, and there's 4 of them, focuses on the particular emission source and shows how to estimate GHG emissions associated with the policy activities. That is covered in another video. The agriculture methodology also provides supporting materials such as templates for the assessment team to use, a toolkit with additional resources and case studies that help support the assessment process. The second part of the assessment provides guidance on selecting and describing the agricultural policy to assess. It's composed of chapters 3 and 4. With chapter 3, the users can review trends in emissions, common agricultural mitigation measures, and policy instruments. And then they can go through a process to prioritize and select a policy for assessment. If the team already has a clear idea about which policy they want to assess, they can spend less time on chapter 3 and move forward with describing the policy. This includes outlining policy activities, identifying intermediate effects and GHG impacts, developing a causal chain, and selecting policy assessment boundary and period. And finally, considering what other policy interactions may occur with this policy. So the revised guide contains information on agricultural mitigation measures that address some of the most dominant emission sources. For each mitigation measure, we include information about what the general mechanism is, what the enabling conditions are, some synergies and trade-offs when implementing it, as well as the mitigation potential based on literature studies and typical abatement cost. So the mitigation measures are reflective of the most dominant emission sources and are organized by those sources in the guide. Here we just show one example for feed management, which is a common mitigation measure to address enteric fermentation emissions in livestock. Having this information will be helpful when we get to the next steps of describing the policy and understanding the related GHG impacts. In addition to describing mitigation measures, the guide provides helpful information on policy instruments, which are mechanisms that enable the implementation of the mitigation measures. Multiple policy instruments can be combined to achieve the desired policy objective. And here you see the different categories of policy instruments that are covered in the guide. You will find a description of each of these, as well as examples that can help you kind of determine which policy instrument may be the most applicable to the types of activities that you're trying to implement. And just to give an example, under subsidies and incentives, which is a common mechanism, policy instrument that's applied in agricultural policies, you may have something like a tax reduction to farmers that adopt a certain land cultivation method. You may also provide incentive payments for changing agricultural practices that you want to see more of on the ground. And then another way that subsidies and incentives can be implemented is by offering affordable low-interest loan schemes that can support upfront investment when the farmer is changing a practice and needs to purchase additional equipment or invest in their operation. This guide provides a rubric to help select a policy for assessment, because it's not always apparent which one is going to be the best candidate for that. And given that it takes some resources to go through this effort, it's helpful to go through an exercise to prioritize which policy should be assessed. This process involves identifying several policies for assessment and compiling some preliminary information about each one. And then when that information is put together, you would apply a qualitative ranking to determine which policy is the best fit for the assessment. The guide provides a series of questions that you would answer to help determine this, but typically the most relevant considerations in this prioritization process will likely focus on anticipated impact on GHG emissions. So since this is a mitigation impact assessment, that will be a big driver in the decision. The other one will be availability of data, because that is often the barrier. If data is not available, it's very difficult to conduct this assessment. And then the third factor is institutional alignment. So if this is a policy that is of high priority and interest to the government, and the ministry resources are allocated to its implementation, it's more likely that the data will be available, and it will be easier to collaborate and coordinate with the team that's implementing the policy for the assessment. Other considerations can also help prioritize. For example, whether the policy impacts stakeholders in any particular way can be used to further help determine which policy should be selected for assessment. So once a policy is selected, the guide outlines the steps to describe the policy. And then this description becomes the basis for the assessment of GHG impacts and potentially other impacts as well. So the components that go into describing the policy include outlining all the activities, identifying intermediate effects, and then the GHG impacts that arise from those, developing a causal chain, selecting assessment boundary and period, and considering policy synergies and interactions. There are templates available as part of the guide to facilitate this process. And you will see this symbol also throughout the guide to kind of identify steps where templates can be used. And they will really help add some structure to this process. So we start by compiling information that describes what's happening under the policy. And then this is then used to kind of determine what GHG impacts will be estimated and set the assessment boundary. A lot of this information will also be helpful in reporting under the Enhanced Transparency Framework. And we identify the components that are part of the policy description that are also required for international reporting in the guide. And then after the general description is complete, we go deeper into identifying and characterizing the inputs, activities, intermediate effects of the policy, and documenting expected changes as a result of the policy. So which direction will this parameter change in? What type of land will it affect? When will this impact be expected to occur, and things like that. So this really helps to start zeroing in on which parameters are going to be really important, which data types are going to be really important in the assessment. And then the next part is really taking that to the final kind of impact level of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as maybe some other impacts that aren't related to greenhouse gases, but are still important, could be market effects or environmental effects as well that can also be affected by the policy. Describing policy activities can be done using these templates and the tables that we provide in the guide. But another tool that is offered is called the causal chain, which traces the process by which the policy leads to GHG impacts through kind of a sequential and logical series of steps that really demonstrate the cause and effect relationship between them. You see here on the right is a diagram that shows an example. And it's a really helpful way to visually represent what's happening as a result of the policy and capture kind of how the policies lead to changes in emissions. This is also a very good tool for stakeholder engagement because it allows kind of a more visual representation of the information that's easier to engage with and discuss. Determining the assessment boundary is really important because you may identify a whole suite of different GHG impacts as a result of the policy, but due to capacity constraints or data availability, you may not be able to assess them all. And so the assessment boundary helps you determine which impacts are actually going to fall within the assessment calculations, and they're based on the likelihood and the magnitude of those effects. And if they reach a certain threshold, they are labeled as significant and then are included in the assessment. So the guide includes this matrix and additional information to help the assessment team through this process. Basically, after you identify all the GHG impacts of the policy, you go through a series of steps to determine whether that impact is significant, and if it is, it's included in the assessment, or if it's not significant because it may be small in relative size, or maybe unlikely, or maybe not enough information is available to determine how likely it is, then you would set it aside and not include it in the assessment boundary. The key is to document all these decisions and rationales for setting the assessment boundary in a transparent way. And so if you come back to this assessment and have additional information or data, you can revisit what the assessment boundary included and potentially refine the assessment. So last step in describing the policy involves identifying policy synergies and interactions. And there could be several different kinds of interactions that are important to consider. One is if this policy and other policies may affect the same greenhouse gas source or carbon pool. Another type of interaction, if the impacts from the policy you selected for assessing and other policies or activities lead to kind of an effect that would be more or less than if you were just to implement these two policies independently. And then also there may be impacts beyond greenhouse gases, environmental or economic impacts in the sustainable development realm. And so this guide focuses on single policy assessments. So we don't have specific information on how to handle assessing policies as a package, but the description that is put together as part of this step can be used as a basis for other assessments as well, and is a nice kind of starting point to assess policy across these different types of impacts. There's also tools in the guide that we point to that can help with exploring how to assess a package of policies together when you identify if these kinds of synergies and interactions exist. So this concludes the step to select and describe the policy. And you can find out more information about the guide itself and this particular part on the ICAT website. If you go to the toolbox option and select assessment guides, you will land on the page that has a number of different assessment guides offered by ICAT. And if you select agriculture, it will take you to the page where all the materials are available for download and your use. So with that, I would like to thank the team that was involved in developing this guide, my co-authors and the team that provided activity data, reviewers and advisors, and the design and layout team. Thank you for listening and your interest in the guide. Don't hesitate to reach out for more information. You can contact GHGMI or ICAT for that. And thank you again for listening. I hope you check out the guide.